The Mediterranean sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Dr. Margaret Davis stepped onto the pristine deck of the research vessel, Deep Explorer, her weathered canvas bag slung over one shoulder and her simple cotton dress already wilting in the heat. At 62, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, she looked more like someone's grandmother than a member of the most prestigious deep-sea archaeological expedition of the decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crew members barely glanced her way as she made her way toward the main laboratory, their attention focused on the impressive array of high-tech equipment being calibrated for what the scientific community was calling the discovery mission of the century. The Deep Explorer represented the pinnacle of marine research technology, a floating laboratory worth over $100 million that housed the most advanced underwater exploration systems ever assembled. Sonar arrays capable of penetrating 3 miles beneath the ocean floor lined the vessel's hull, while robotic submersibles equipped with precision excavation tools waited in specialized bays for deployment into the mysterious depths. The expedition had attracted the attention of universities, governments, and private foundations worldwide, all eager to be associated with what preliminary sonar readings suggested could be the archaeological find that would rewrite human history. Dr. Harrison Blake emerged from the main laboratory like a peacock displaying his plumage, his crisp white shirt and designer sunglasses marking him as someone accustomed to being the center of attention wherever he went. At 45, he had built his reputation on a series of underwater discoveries that had made him the darling of academic conferences and television documentaries. His perfectly styled hair and practiced smile suggested someone who understood that modern archaeology was as much about public relations as it was about actual research. The sight of Maggie approaching with her humble appearance and outdated equipment bag triggered the kind of dismissive expression he typically reserved for graduate students who dared to question his theories. The morning briefing was scheduled to begin in the main conference room, where the expedition's elite team would review their objectives for what everyone expected to be a routine archaeological survey of a recently discovered underwater formation. The Mediterranean Sea, 200 miles southwest of Cyprus, had revealed unusual geometric patterns during satellite surveys, patterns that didn't match any known geological formations. Initial sonar sweeps had detected what appeared to be artificial structures buried beneath centuries of sediment, structures that exhibited the kind of precise mathematical relationships that suggested advanced engineering capabilities. Captain Robert Miller commanded the Deep Explorer with the confidence of someone who had spent 30 years navigating the world's most challenging waters. His weathered face and steady hands reflected decades of experience managing complex scientific missions, though his current assignment represented the most ambitious project of his career. The presence of multiple government agencies, university departments, and private research foundations had created a political minefield that required diplomatic skills beyond his typical maritime expertise. The last thing he needed was complications from personnel who didn't understand the stakes involved in what could become the most significant archaeological discovery since the tomb of Tutankhamun. Maggie found herself assigned to a small workstation in the corner of the laboratory, where she quietly unpacked equipment that appeared antiquated compared to the gleaming instruments surrounding her. Her sonar analysis devices looked like museum pieces next to the state-of-the-art systems being prepared by younger researchers. And her diving gear bore the scars of decades of use in conditions that would have challenged far more expensive equipment. The other team members processed paperwork and made final preparations with the efficient bustle of professionals accustomed to high-stakes missions, though their occasional glances in her direction suggested curiosity about why someone so obviously out of place had been included in such an important expedition. Dr. Jennifer Walsh supervised the loading of the final equipment with the precision of someone whose entire career depended on the success of this particular mission. As head of the Pacific Marine Research Institute, she had staked her professional reputation on the theory that the underwater formations represented evidence of an advanced ancient civilization, possibly the legendary Atlantis itself. The preliminary data supported her hypothesis, but she needed concrete proof that would satisfy the international scientific community and secure the funding necessary for extended research operations. The presence of Margaret Davis on her carefully selected team remained a mystery that she planned to resolve once the expedition was properly underway. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly in all directions as the Deep Explorer reached its designated research coordinates, the water so deep and clear that looking over the side created the illusion of floating in space rather than sailing on an ocean. 3,000 meters below the surface, sophisticated sonar systems had detected anomalies that defied conventional explanation. Geometric patterns emerged from the seafloor with mathematical precision that suggested intentional construction rather than natural formation. The shapes were too regular, too purposeful to be the result of geological processes, yet they appeared to predate any known civilization capable of such advanced underwater construction. Professor Stephen Clark arrived via helicopter transfer, his academic credentials and university connections having secured him a position on the expedition despite his complete lack of practical deep-sea experience. His presence represented the institutional support that made large-scale research possible, though his tendency to treat ocean exploration like a classroom lecture created tension with crew members who understood the dangerous realities of working 3 miles beneath the surface. He carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to deference from students and colleagues, an attitude that extended to his interactions with everyone he considered professionally inferior. The preliminary dive preparations revealed the expedition's ambitious scope and the challenges that lay ahead. The target depth of 3,000 meters required specialized equipment and techniques that pushed the boundaries of current underwater archaeology. Pressure at such depths could crush conventional diving equipment in seconds, while the complete absence of natural light created navigation challenges that demanded absolute precision from both human operators and robotic systems. The margin for error was non-existent, and any equipment failure could result in the loss of millions of dollars worth of irreplaceable research tools. Maggie observed the preparations with keen attention, her experienced eye identifying potential problems that the younger researchers seemed to overlook in their excitement about the mission's historic significance. The pressure suits being prepared for deep-sea operations showed stress patterns that suggested previous hard use, while the calibration readings on several critical instruments fell outside optimal parameters. Her attempts to point out these concerns were politely dismissed by team leaders, who clearly viewed her contributions as well-intentioned but irrelevant observations from someone who lacked understanding of modern research protocols. The Deep Explorer's main laboratory buzzed with activity as teams of specialists prepared for the first descent to the mysterious underwater formations. Computer screens displayed real-time sonar data that revealed increasingly detailed images of the structures below, structures that appeared to exhibit architectural sophistication far beyond anything associated with ancient Mediterranean civilizations. The geometric precision of the formations suggested advanced mathematical knowledge, while their massive scale indicated construction capabilities that challenged conventional understanding of prehistoric human societies. Dr. Blake held court near the main sonar display, explaining his theories about the formations to anyone within hearing distance, with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a mystery he couldn't solve through the application of conventional archaeological methods. His voice carried across the laboratory as he outlined his plans for systematic excavation that would reveal the true nature of the underwater structures, while maintaining the scientific rigor necessary for international peer review. The younger researchers hung on his every word, clearly impressed by his reputation and eager to be associated with what promised to be a career-defining discovery. Sarah Chen, a marine biologist fresh from graduate school, found herself fascinated by the biological implications of the underwater formations. Her preliminary analysis of water samples taken from the site revealed unusual mineral compositions that didn't match known Mediterranean seafloor characteristics. The presence of rare earth elements in concentrations far exceeding normal levels suggested geological processes that she couldn't explain using conventional understanding of underwater mineral distribution. Her excitement about these anomalies was tempered by the knowledge that her junior status made it unlikely that anyone would take her observations seriously without supporting evidence from more experienced researchers. The afternoon brought the first serious technical challenge, as the expedition's primary remotely operated vehicle experienced malfunction during pre-dive testing. The ROV's sophisticated camera and excavation systems represented the expedition's primary means of exploring the underwater formations, and its failure threatened to delay the mission indefinitely. Dr. Blake's confident demeanor showed the first signs of strain as he realized that equipment problems could undermine his carefully planned research schedule and damage his reputation for delivering results under pressure. Lieutenant Mark Rodriguez represented the naval interests in the expedition, his presence justified by the potential strategic implications of discovering an advanced ancient civilization in Mediterranean waters. His military training had taught him to assess situations with pragmatic realism rather than academic optimism, and his evaluation of the expedition's preparedness suggested serious vulnerabilities that could compromise both mission success and personnel safety. The combination of ambitious objectives, complex equipment, and challenging environmental conditions created a situation where multiple factors could contribute to catastrophic failure. Maggie's quiet presence in the corner of the laboratory allowed her to observe the team dynamics that were developing as the expedition faced its first significant obstacle. The younger researchers looked to Dr. Blake for leadership, while the technical specialists focused on their equipment with the intensity of professionals who understood that human lives depended on mechanical reliability. The pressure to succeed was palpable, creating an atmosphere where admitting uncertainty or requesting assistance could be interpreted as professional weakness rather than prudent caution. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ROV malfunction revealed the first cracks in the expedition's facade of professional competence. The sophisticated diagnostic systems that should have identified the problem instead provided contradictory readings that suggested multiple simultaneous failures in critical components. Dr. Foster, the sonar specialist, ran repeated tests that yielded increasingly confusing results, while Jake Thompson worked frantically to repair systems that appeared to be functioning normally despite their obvious failure to operate correctly. The growing frustration in the laboratory reflected the realization that modern technology wasn't always as reliable as press releases and marketing materials suggested. As the afternoon progressed, it became clear that the ROV problems were more serious than initially expected. The backup systems that should have provided redundant capability showed similar mysterious malfunctions, while the diagnostic protocols developed for such emergencies proved inadequate for troubleshooting problems that seemed to defy logical explanation. The expedition's carefully planned timeline began to collapse, as equipment that had functioned perfectly during pre-mission testing failed repeatedly under actual operational conditions. Captain Miller's growing concern reflected his understanding that weather conditions in the Mediterranean could change rapidly, potentially forcing the expedition to abandon its research site before completing its objectives. The narrow window of optimal conditions for deep-sea operations meant that any significant delays could result in mission failure and the loss of financial support from sponsors who expected concrete results in exchange for their substantial investments. The pressure to solve the technical problems quickly was mounting, but rushing repairs on equipment critical to personnel safety violated every protocol he had learned during his decades of maritime experience. Dr. Walsh's reaction to the equipment failures revealed the enormous personal and professional stakes involved in the expedition's success. Her theory about the underwater formations representing Atlantis had already attracted international attention, creating expectations that would be difficult to manage if the mission failed to produce supporting evidence. The combination of academic rivalry, media scrutiny, and institutional politics meant that failure would have consequences extending far beyond the current expedition, potentially ending careers and closing research programs that had taken years to develop. The evening brought a crisis that threatened to end the expedition before it could accomplish any of its ambitious objectives. The primary sonar array experienced complete system failure, leaving the team without the navigational capabilities necessary for safe operations at 3,000-meter depths. The backup systems that should have maintained basic functionality showed similar problems, while emergency repair protocols failed to restore even minimal operational capacity. The sophisticated technology that had made the mission possible was failing systematically, creating a situation where the expedition faced potential cancellation, despite its enormous expense and international significance. Professor Clark's response to the crisis revealed his complete lack of practical experience with the realities of deep-sea research. His suggestions for proceeding without full sonar capability demonstrated dangerous ignorance of the safety requirements for underwater operations, while his impatience with equipment delays reflected someone who had never faced the possibility of equipment failure resulting in human casualties. The gap between academic theory and operational reality was becoming apparent to everyone except the professor himself, creating additional tension in an already stressful situation. The technical problems that plagued the expedition's equipment seemed to intensify as darkness fell over the Mediterranean. Systems that had been functioning intermittently throughout the day failed completely, while emergency procedures designed to maintain minimal operational capability proved ineffective against malfunctions that appeared to violate the basic principles of electronic engineering. The growing sense of frustration and confusion among the technical specialists reflected their inability to explain, much less solve, problems that seemed to defy logical analysis. Maggie had remained quietly observant throughout the crisis, her experienced eye noting patterns in the equipment failures that the younger researchers seemed to miss in their focus on individual technical problems. The systematic nature of the malfunctions suggested underlying issues that went beyond simple mechanical breakdown, while the timing of the failures seemed to coincide with specific operational procedures in ways that implied connections between seemingly unrelated systems. Her decades of experience with underwater research equipment had taught her to recognize the subtle signs that often preceded major system failures, signs that were becoming increasingly apparent as the evening progressed. The prospect of mission cancellation hung over the Deep Explorer like a storm cloud, as the expedition's leadership struggled to find solutions for problems that seemed to multiply faster than they could be addressed. The financial implications of failure were staggering, while the professional consequences for everyone involved could be career-ending. The combination of public expectations, academic reputations, and institutional commitments created a situation where admitting defeat wasn't just disappointing, it was potentially catastrophic for everyone whose futures depended on the expedition's success. As midnight approached and the Mediterranean stars reflected off the calm surface of the sea above the mysterious underwater formations, it became clear that the expedition faced a choice between proceeding with unreliable equipment or acknowledging that the most sophisticated marine research technology available wasn't sufficient for the challenges posed by the deep-sea environment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that humanity's greatest archaeological discovery might remain hidden because the tools designed to reveal it couldn't function properly when they were needed most. The simple woman in the corner of the laboratory continued her quiet observations, waiting for the moment when decades of experience might finally prove more valuable than the latest technology money could buy. The dawn brought no relief from the technical nightmares that had plagued the Deep Explorer throughout the night. Dr. Blake stood in the main laboratory surrounded by diagnostic reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of equipment failures that seemed to defy every principle of marine engineering. The primary sonar array remained completely unresponsive despite overnight repair attempts, while the backup navigation systems continued to provide readings so erratic that using them for deep-sea operations would be tantamount to suicide. His carefully groomed appearance from the previous day had given way to rumpled clothing and bloodshot eyes that reflected a sleepless night spent watching his reputation crumble along with the expedition's sophisticated technology. Captain Miller emerged from the communications center with weather reports that added urgency to an already desperate situation. A massive storm system was approaching from the northwest, bringing with it the kind of sustained winds and heavy seas that would force the Deep Explorer to abandon its research site within 48 hours. The narrow window for completing the mission was closing rapidly, while the equipment necessary for safe underwater operations remained stubbornly non-functional despite the best efforts of the expedition's technical specialists. The irony of potentially losing the greatest archaeological discovery in human history due to mechanical failures wasn't lost on anyone, though the bitter taste of defeat was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Dr. Walsh convened an emergency meeting in the ship's main conference room, her usual composure showing signs of strain as she faced the possibility of explaining to international sponsors how millions of dollars in funding had failed to produce any meaningful results. The assembled team looked like survivors of a technical disaster rather than elite researchers on the verge of historic discovery. Equipment manuals lay scattered across tables next to empty coffee cups and the debris of failed troubleshooting attempts, while computer screens displayed error messages that had become depressingly familiar during the long night of futile repair efforts. The meeting began with Jake Thompson delivering a comprehensive status report that confirmed everyone's worst fears about the expedition's technical capabilities. The primary ROV showed multiple system failures that affected everything from camera operations to excavation tools, while the backup units displayed similar problems that suggested systematic rather than isolated malfunctions. The sonar arrays that should have provided precise navigation at depth remained completely offline, leaving the expedition without the basic safety equipment necessary for conducting operations 3,000 meters below the surface. Even the ship's emergency communication systems were experiencing intermittent failures that violated fundamental maritime safety protocols. Professor Clark's response to the crisis revealed his dangerous ignorance of practical deep-sea operations and his willingness to risk human lives rather than admit failure. His suggestion that the expedition proceed using visual navigation techniques appropriate for shallow-water archaeology demonstrated complete misunderstanding of the challenges posed by working in total darkness at crushing pressures where the slightest error could result in catastrophic equipment loss and crew casualties. His academic credentials meant nothing in an environment where theoretical knowledge was useless without practical experience, yet his institutional authority gave weight to recommendations that more experienced personnel recognized as potentially fatal. Sarah Chen had spent the night analyzing water samples with increasing fascination and growing concern about anomalies that seemed to intensify as the expedition's equipment problems mounted. Her marine biology background had taught her to recognize patterns in oceanic data that often preceded unusual environmental events, and the readings she was obtaining suggested something far more complex than simple archaeological remains buried beneath the seafloor. The mineral compositions were unlike anything documented in Mediterranean waters, while electromagnetic readings indicated energy signatures that defied conventional explanation. Her attempts to share these findings with senior researchers had been dismissed as irrelevant to the mission's archaeological objectives, though she suspected that understanding these anomalies might be crucial to explaining the equipment failures. Lieutenant Rodriguez observed the deteriorating situation with military pragmatism that prioritized personnel safety over mission objectives. His assessment of the expedition's current capabilities suggested that continuing operations without reliable equipment would violate every safety protocol developed for deep-sea research, while the approaching storm system meant that any rescue operations would become impossible within the next 24 hours. The combination of equipment failure and environmental threats created a situation where the prudent course was immediate evacuation, regardless of the mission's scientific significance or the professional consequences for everyone involved. Dr. Foster worked frantically with sonar equipment that seemed to mock her expertise with every failed diagnostic test. Her years of experience with underwater acoustic systems had never prepared her for malfunctions that appeared to violate the basic principles of sound propagation through water. The equipment registered targets that couldn't be confirmed visually, while simultaneously failing to detect objects that were clearly visible on backup systems. The contradictory readings suggested either complete instrument failure or environmental conditions so unusual that they fell outside the parameters for which the equipment had been designed. Maggie had remained in her corner workstation throughout the crisis, quietly observing the mounting technical problems with the calm attention of someone who had seen similar situations develop during her decades of underwater research. Her antiquated equipment continued to function normally while the expedition's state-of-the-art systems failed systematically, an irony that hadn't escaped her notice, though she had chosen not to comment on the situation. Her weathered hands moved efficiently across instruments that looked primitive compared to the sophisticated technology surrounding them, yet which continued to provide reliable data, while everything else malfunctioned mysteriously. The patterns emerging from Maggie's observations suggested explanations for the equipment failures that the expedition's specialists had overlooked in their focus on mechanical diagnostics. The timing of the malfunctions corresponded with specific electromagnetic fluctuations that her older instruments detected clearly, while the newer systems seemed unable to filter the interference that was disrupting their normal operations. Her experience with similar phenomena during classified research projects had taught her to recognize the signs of environmental conditions that could affect electronic equipment in ways that conventional engineering didn't anticipate. Dr. Blake's growing desperation manifested itself in increasingly irrational decisions that reflected his unwillingness to accept that the mission might fail despite his confident predictions of success. His insistence on attempting equipment repairs that exceeded safe operational limits demonstrated dangerous prioritization of personal reputation over crew safety, while his dismissal of conservative recommendations showed someone whose judgment was being compromised by pressure to deliver results regardless of the risks involved. The transformation from confident expedition leader to desperate gambler was becoming apparent to everyone except Blake himself. The afternoon brought news that transformed the crisis from challenging to potentially catastrophic. The approaching storm system had intensified beyond all meteorological predictions. developing into a massive cyclonic formation that threatened to generate waves exceeding 30 feet and sustained winds that would make any surface operations impossible for at least a week. Captain Miller's assessment of the situation was stark and uncompromising. The Deep Explorer needed to evacuate its research site within 12 hours or risk being trapped in conditions that could threaten the vessel's survival. The weather window that had seemed adequate for completing the mission had collapsed into a narrow escape opportunity that was closing rapidly. The evacuation preparations revealed the full extent of the expedition's equipment problems, as critical systems needed for safe departure showed the same mysterious malfunctions that had plagued the research operations. The navigation systems that should have guided the Deep Explorer away from the dangerous waters near the underwater formations provided erratic readings that could easily result in the ship running aground on submerged obstacles. The communication equipment necessary for coordinating with rescue services continued to experience intermittent failures that violated fundamental maritime safety requirements, while emergency backup systems designed to prevent such disasters remained stubbornly non-functional. Dr. Walsh faced the terrible choice between abandoning the mission immediately or risking the lives of everyone aboard in a desperate attempt to salvage some meaningful results from months of preparation and millions of dollars in investment. The professional consequences of returning empty-handed would be severe, potentially ending careers and closing research programs that had taken years to develop. However, the alternative of proceeding with unreliable equipment in deteriorating weather conditions carried risks that extended far beyond professional embarrassment to include genuine threats to human survival. The technical specialists worked with increasing desperation to restore even minimal functionality to systems that seemed determined to remain non-operational despite their best efforts. Emergency repair procedures that should have provided temporary solutions proved ineffective against malfunctions that appeared to intensify rather than diminish with conventional troubleshooting approaches. The sophisticated diagnostic tools designed to identify equipment problems provided contradictory readings that suggested either multiple simultaneous failures or environmental conditions so unusual that they fell outside the parameters for which the instruments had been calibrated. Jake Thompson's latest status report painted a picture of systematic equipment failure that defied logical explanation and threatened to strand the expedition in increasingly dangerous conditions. The primary engines that powered the Deep Explorer were beginning to show signs of the same electromagnetic interference that had disabled the research equipment, while backup systems designed to prevent such catastrophic failures remained mysteriously unresponsive. The prospect of being trapped on a disabled vessel in storm conditions 3,000 meters above one of the deepest and most remote areas of the Mediterranean was becoming frighteningly real. Professor Clark's reaction to the mounting crisis revealed dangerous denial of reality that could have fatal consequences for everyone involved. His continued insistence that the expedition proceed with its archaeological objectives despite obvious safety threats demonstrated academic arrogance that prioritized theoretical discoveries over practical survival concerns. His lack of experience with actual deep-sea operations made him unable to comprehend the genuine dangers posed by equipment failure in remote maritime environments, while his institutional authority gave weight to recommendations that experienced personnel recognized as potentially suicidal. Sarah Chen's latest analysis of water samples revealed electromagnetic signatures that were intensifying as the storm approached, creating patterns that seemed to correlate with the equipment failures plaguing the expedition. Her marine biology training had never prepared her for readings that suggested energy sources far more powerful than anything associated with known geological processes, yet the data was too consistent to be dismissed as instrument error. The possibility that the underwater formations were somehow responsible for the systematic equipment failures seemed impossible according to conventional science, yet the correlation between proximity to the site and technical malfunctions was becoming too obvious to ignore. Lieutenant Rodriguez initiated emergency evacuation procedures with military efficiency that reflected his understanding of the gravity of the situation developing around the Deep Explorer. His assessment of the vessel's current capabilities suggested that remaining in the research area for more than a few additional hours would create genuine survival threats that extended far beyond mission failure to include potential loss of life. The approaching storm system, combined with systematic equipment failures, had created a perfect storm of circumstances that required immediate action regardless of the expedition's scientific objectives. Dr. Foster's final attempts to restore sonar functionality revealed anomalies that challenged her understanding of underwater acoustic propagation and suggested environmental conditions unlike anything documented in her years of marine research. The equipment detected massive structures beneath the seafloor that seemed to extend far beyond the geometric formations that had originally attracted the expedition's attention. Structures that appeared to be generating electromagnetic interference powerful enough to disrupt modern electronic systems. The implications of such discoveries were staggering, yet the deteriorating situation made it impossible to conduct the careful investigation that such findings demanded. The emergency evacuation order came from Captain Miller with the authority of someone whose maritime experience had taught him to recognize when continuing operations became an unacceptable risk to human life. The Deep Explorer would abandon its research site within 6 hours, regardless of the mission's scientific significance or the professional consequences for expedition members. The decision was final and non-negotiable, based on weather predictions and equipment assessments that left no room for debate or delay. The greatest archaeological expedition in human history was ending in failure and retreat, leaving behind mysteries that might never be solved. Maggie listened to the evacuation announcement with the calm attention of someone whose experience had taught her to recognize the difference between temporary setbacks and genuine emergencies. Her quiet observation of the crisis had revealed patterns that the expedition's specialists had missed in their focus on individual technical problems, patterns that suggested solutions might exist for someone with the right knowledge and experience. The sophisticated equipment that had failed so systematically represented only one approach to deep-sea research, an approach that assumed environmental conditions would always fall within predictable parameters. The chaos that followed the evacuation order revealed the expedition's complete dependence on technology that had proven unreliable when conditions exceeded normal parameters. Crew members struggled with backup systems that should have provided emergency capabilities, but instead offered only additional frustration and delay. The careful planning that had characterized the mission's preparation dissolved into improvised responses to equipment failures that seemed to multiply faster than they could be addressed. The transformation from confident scientific expedition to desperate escape attempt was complete and demoralizing. As the afternoon progressed toward evening and the approaching storm began to affect sea conditions around the Deep Explorer, it became clear that the window for safe evacuation was narrowing more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. The sophisticated weather prediction systems that should have provided accurate forecasts showed the same mysterious malfunctions that had plagued other electronic equipment, leaving navigation decisions dependent on visual observation and decades-old maritime experience rather than modern technology. The irony of humanity's most advanced research vessel being reduced to sailing techniques from previous centuries wasn't lost on anyone familiar with the evolution of marine science. The final equipment status reports painted a picture of systematic failure that seemed to mock everything the expedition represented about modern scientific capability. $1 million sonar arrays remained completely non-functional, while backup systems designed to prevent such catastrophic breakdowns provided only intermittent and unreliable operation. The ROVs that should have been exploring the underwater formations lay motionless in their deployment bays, their sophisticated cameras and excavation tools rendered useless by electromagnetic interference that no one could explain or counteract. The dream of discovering Atlantis was dying amid a sea of diagnostic error messages and failed repair attempts. The evening brought the first serious effects of the approaching storm as wind speeds increased and wave heights began to challenge the Deep Explorer's stability systems. The vessel that had seemed so solid and capable during calm conditions now felt vulnerable and exposed as it struggled against mounting seas, while hampered by equipment failures that affected everything from navigation to basic propulsion. The crew members who had been focused on archaeological discovery just 24 hours earlier now faced the immediate challenge of survival in conditions that were deteriorating faster than weather predictions had suggested possible. Dr. Blake's final attempt to salvage something meaningful from the expedition involved a desperate plan to deploy emergency equipment for one last survey of the underwater formations before the evacuation became mandatory. His proposal violated every safety protocol developed for deep-sea operations and demonstrated judgment so impaired by desperation that even his most loyal supporters began to question his fitness for command. The transformation from confident expedition leader to someone whose decisions threatened crew safety was complete and alarming, reflecting the enormous personal and professional stakes that had been riding on the mission's success. The technical specialists who had worked tirelessly to restore equipment functionality throughout the crisis finally admitted defeat as their best efforts proved insufficient against malfunctions that seemed to intensify rather than diminish with conventional repair approaches. Their expertise with marine research systems had never prepared them for failures that appeared to violate basic engineering principles. while their diagnostic tools provided readings so contradictory that troubleshooting became impossible. The acknowledgement that modern technology had proven inadequate for the challenges posed by the underwater environment was professionally devastating for specialists whose careers had been built on technical competence. Captain Miller's final weather assessment confirmed that the Deep Explorer faced genuine survival threats if evacuation was delayed beyond the next few hours. The storm system had continued to intensify while moving faster than meteorological models had predicted, creating conditions that would make any surface operations extremely dangerous within hours and potentially impossible by morning. The narrow window for safe departure was closing rapidly, while equipment failures that affected basic navigation capabilities meant that even evacuation carried risks that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. As darkness fell over the Mediterranean and the first serious storm waves began to rock the Deep Explorer, the expedition faced the bitter reality that months of preparation and millions of dollars in investment had produced nothing more than a catalog of equipment failures and unanswered questions. The underwater formations that had promised to reveal the secrets of Atlantis would remain hidden beneath the sea floor, their mysteries protected by environmental conditions that had defeated humanity's most sophisticated technology. The greatest archaeological opportunity in human history was slipping away into the depths, leaving behind only frustration and the knowledge that some discoveries might lie forever beyond the reach of conventional science. The simple woman in the corner of the laboratory continued her quiet observations as chaos swirled around her, her experienced hands still working with instruments that predated the digital revolution, but which continued to function reliably while everything else failed. Her decades of underwater research had taught her that sometimes the oldest solutions proved most effective when modern technology encountered conditions beyond its design parameters. The patterns she had been tracking throughout the crisis suggested that conventional approaches to the problem had been fundamentally misguided from the beginning, and that understanding the underwater formations might require techniques that the expedition's specialists had never considered. The storm struck the Deep Explorer with devastating force just as Captain Miller was preparing to issue the final evacuation order. Waves towering 40 feet above the research vessel crashed across the deck with thunderous impacts that sent equipment sliding and crew members scrambling for secure handholds. The wind howled through the ship's superstructure with such intensity that verbal communication became impossible without shouting, while the sophisticated stabilization systems that should have maintained steady operations fluctuated wildly between overcompensation and complete failure. The transformation from manageable weather conditions to life-threatening chaos had occurred with shocking speed, trapping the expedition in exactly the kind of maritime disaster that safety protocols were designed to prevent. Dr. Blake stood in the main laboratory gripping a support beam as the ship rolled through angles that threatened to send unsecured equipment crashing into bulkheads. His face had gone pale, with the realization that his insistence on delaying evacuation had potentially doomed everyone aboard to exactly the kind of catastrophic outcome that experienced maritime professionals had warned against. The sophisticated research equipment that had represented his ticket to archaeological immortality now became deadly projectiles, as the Deep Explorer struggled against seas that exceeded every safety parameter for which the vessel had been designed. His transformation from confident expedition leader to terrified passenger was complete and humiliating. The emergency communication systems that should have enabled coordination with rescue services remained stubbornly non-functional, despite desperate repair attempts by crew members whose expertise with maritime electronics had never encountered failures so systematic and seemingly deliberate. The radio frequencies that should have carried distress signals produced only static interference that seemed to intensify whenever operators attempted to establish contact with shore stations. The GPS navigation systems that modern maritime operations took for granted provided readings so erratic that using them for position determination would have been more dangerous than relying on celestial navigation techniques from the age of sailing ships. Captain Miller fought his way to the bridge through corridors that pitched and rolled with motion so violent that maintaining footing required constant attention and careful timing. His decades of experience with severe weather operations had never prepared him for conditions where basic ship systems failed systematically, while environmental forces exceeded every parameter for safe operation. The combination of equipment malfunctions and extreme weather had created a perfect storm of circumstances that challenged his ability to maintain control over a situation that was deteriorating faster than conventional emergency procedures could address. Dr. Walsh struggled to secure research data that represented years of preparation and millions of dollars in investment, though the violent motion of the ship made such efforts both dangerous and largely futile. Computer systems that should have maintained automatic backups crashed repeatedly as power fluctuations exceeded the tolerances of even military-grade electronics, while storage devices designed to survive extreme conditions showed the same mysterious failures that had plagued other expedition equipment. The prospect of losing not just the mission but all the preparatory research that had made it possible added intellectual devastation to the physical dangers threatening everyone aboard. Lieutenant Rodriguez attempted to coordinate emergency procedures with crew members whose training had never anticipated the combination of equipment failure and extreme weather that now threatened the Deep Explorer. The emergency protocols that should have provided structured responses to maritime disasters assumed that basic communication and navigation systems would remain functional, while backup procedures designed for equipment failure presumed that weather conditions would allow for external rescue operations. The intersection of multiple catastrophic scenarios had created a situation for which no standard procedures existed. The ship's engineering crew worked frantically in conditions that challenged their ability to maintain the basic propulsion and power systems necessary for survival. The massive diesel engines that provided primary power showed signs of the same electromagnetic interference that had disabled research equipment, while backup generators designed to prevent total power loss flickered between normal operation and complete shutdown, with frightening unpredictability. The prospect of losing propulsion while trapped in mountainous seas represented a nightmare scenario that could transform the current emergency into a fight for survival that might last for days. Sarah Chen found herself thrown against laboratory equipment as a particularly violent wave sent the Deep Explorer rolling through angles that seemed to defy the vessel's design limitations. Her water samples, which had revealed such intriguing anomalies during calmer conditions, now scattered across the deck in a chaos of broken glass and spilled chemicals that made further analysis impossible. The electromagnetic readings that had so fascinated her during the previous days now seemed ominous rather than merely unusual, suggesting connections between the underwater formations and the systematic equipment failures that she was only beginning to understand. Dr. Foster struggled with sonar equipment that had become not just non-functional, but actively dangerous as power surges threatened to damage systems throughout the ship. Her attempts to maintain even minimal acoustic monitoring capabilities resulted in feedback loops that produced sound levels capable of causing permanent hearing damage, while the diagnostic displays showed patterns that seemed to mock her years of experience with underwater detection systems. The transformation of familiar technology into incomprehensible hazards reflected the complete breakdown of normal operational parameters that had defined her professional competence. Jake Thompson worked desperately to maintain basic electrical systems as power fluctuations threatened to plunge the Deep Explorer into total darkness, while being battered by seas that could easily crush a disabled vessel. His expertise with marine electrical systems had never prepared him for malfunctions that seemed to propagate through supposedly isolated circuits, while his diagnostic tools provided readings that violated fundamental principles of electrical engineering. The equipment that should have been protecting the ship's crew was failing in ways that transformed familiar technology into unpredictable hazards. Professor Clark clung to furniture in his cabin, as the academic theories that had seemed so compelling during calm conditions proved utterly irrelevant to the immediate challenge of survival in conditions that exceeded human experience. His institutional authority meant nothing in an environment where theoretical knowledge was useless without practical skills, while his earlier dismissal of safety concerns now seemed dangerously naive rather than boldly visionary. The gap between classroom learning and maritime reality had never been more apparent or more potentially fatal. The violent motion of the ship made normal movement through the Deep Explorer's corridors and compartments extremely hazardous, as unsecured equipment transformed into projectiles capable of causing serious injury. Crew members found themselves trapped in spaces where they had been working when the storm struck, unable to reach emergency stations or coordinate with other personnel due to communication failures and physical barriers created by the ship's extreme motion. The sophisticated vessel that had represented the pinnacle of marine research capability was being reduced to a basic survival platform struggling against forces beyond its design parameters. Maggie remained at her corner workstation with the calm stability of someone whose decades of experience had taught her to recognize the difference between genuine emergencies and situations that merely appeared desperate to inexperienced personnel. Her weathered hands continued to work efficiently with instruments that predated modern digital technology, but which continued to provide reliable data while everything else failed catastrophically. The patterns emerging from her readings suggested explanations for the systematic equipment failures that the expedition specialists had overlooked in their focus on conventional troubleshooting approaches. The electromagnetic signatures that Maggie's older instruments detected with clarity were intensifying as the storm reached its peak fury, creating interference patterns that modern electronics couldn't filter or compensate for effectively. Her experience with similar phenomena during classified research projects had taught her to recognize environmental conditions that could affect technology in ways that conventional engineering education didn't anticipate. The underwater formations weren't just archaeological curiosities but active sources of energy that interacted with electronic systems according to principles that mainstream science had yet to acknowledge or understand. Dr. Blake's desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of leadership authority crumbled, as the reality of the situation became undeniable even to someone whose judgment had been compromised by professional ambition. His insistence on continuing operations despite obvious safety threats had contributed directly to the current crisis, while his lack of practical experience with emergency maritime operations made him more liability than asset in circumstances that demanded immediate competent action. The transformation from confident expedition leader to panicked passenger was complete and witnessed by everyone whose respect he had hoped to earn through archaeological discovery. The Deep Explorer's sophisticated navigation systems provided position readings so contradictory that using them for course determination would have been more dangerous than navigating by instinct and experience alone. The GPS satellites that modern maritime operations depended upon seemed unable to penetrate whatever interference was emanating from the underwater formations, while backup navigation systems designed to function independently showed similar degradation that suggested systematic rather than random equipment failure. The prospect of being lost at sea while surrounded by the most advanced navigation technology available represented an irony that wasn't lost on crew members struggling to maintain basic operational capability. Captain Miller's assessment of the ship's condition revealed damage that went beyond simple equipment malfunction to include structural stress that threatened the vessel's integrity under continued battering by extreme seas. The hull monitoring systems that should have provided precise information about the ship's structural condition displayed readings so erratic that determining actual damage levels became impossible, while visual inspection was prevented by weather conditions that made movement on deck potentially fatal. The uncertainty about the Deep Explorer's ability to survive continued storm conditions added another layer of danger to an already desperate situation. The emergency evacuation procedures that should have provided structured responses to maritime disasters proved inadequate for conditions where basic assumptions about equipment functionality no longer applied. Life rafts that depended on electronic deployment systems remained secured in their mountings despite repeated activation attempts, while emergency communication devices designed to summon rescue services produced only static interference that seemed to intensify with each transmission attempt. The sophisticated safety systems that modern maritime regulations required had become unreliable exactly when they were most needed. Lieutenant Rodriguez's military training had prepared him for equipment failure and extreme weather conditions, but never for the combination of systematic technological breakdown and environmental forces that now threatened the Deep Explorer. His attempts to coordinate emergency responses with crew members were hampered by communication failures that made even basic coordination difficult, while the standard emergency procedures that should have provided structured responses to maritime disasters assumed operational capabilities that no longer existed. The intersection of multiple catastrophic scenarios had created a situation that exceeded the parameters of conventional emergency planning. The storm's intensity continued to increase beyond all meteorological predictions, as electromagnetic interference from the underwater formation seemed to affect even weather monitoring systems that should have been immune to such influences. The satellite communications that modern weather forecasting depended upon provided data so corrupted that prediction became impossible, while local atmospheric conditions showed patterns that violated conventional understanding of storm development and intensification. The Deep Explorer was trapped in weather conditions that exceeded not just the vessel's design limitations but the scientific community's ability to predict or explain such phenomena. Dr. Walsh watched helplessly as research data representing years of preparation disappeared into the chaos of equipment failure in extreme weather conditions. The sophisticated computer systems that should have maintained automatic backups of critical information crashed repeatedly as power fluctuations exceeded the tolerances of even military-grade electronics, while portable storage devices designed to survive extreme conditions showed the same mysterious failures that had plagued other expedition equipment. The intellectual investment that had made the mission possible was being destroyed, along with any hope of salvaging meaningful results from the disaster. The engineering crew's desperate attempts to maintain basic ship systems revealed the extent to which modern vessels depended on electronic controls that had proven vulnerable to whatever interference was emanating from the underwater formations. The massive diesel engines that provided primary propulsion required computer management systems that flickered between normal operation and complete failure with frightening unpredictability, while manual backup controls designed for emergency operations proved inadequate for maintaining stable power output under extreme conditions. The prospect of losing propulsion while battered by 40-foot seas represented a nightmare scenario that could easily prove fatal for everyone aboard. Sarah Chen's analysis of the electromagnetic phenomena affecting the Deep Explorer suggested energy sources far more powerful than anything associated with known geological processes. Yet the violent motion of the ship made detailed investigation impossible. Her marine biology training had never prepared her for readings that indicated environmental conditions unlike anything documented in scientific literature, while the correlation between proximity to the underwater formations and equipment failures was becoming too obvious to dismiss as coincidence. The possibility that the archaeological site was somehow responsible for the systematic technological breakdown seemed impossible according to conventional science. Yet the evidence was mounting with each failed system. The communication blackout that had isolated the Deep Explorer from external assistance became complete, as even emergency radio frequencies succumbed to interference that seemed to intensify with each transmission attempt. The rescue services that should have been coordinating emergency response operations had no way of determining the expedition's location or condition, while the weather conditions that prevented aircraft operations also made surface rescue attempts extremely hazardous for vessels not already trapped in the storm. The Deep Explorer had become effectively invisible to the outside world, while fighting for survival against forces that exceeded every safety parameter. Dr. Foster's final attempts to restore sonar functionality revealed acoustic anomalies that suggested the underwater formations were far more extensive than initial surveys had indicated, extending deep into the seafloor with geometric precision that defied conventional explanation. The sound patterns detected by her failing equipment indicated structures of massive scale and sophisticated design, yet the electromagnetic interference that was crippling modern technology made detailed analysis impossible. The archaeological discovery that should have been the expedition's greatest triumph was becoming visible only as the technological tools needed to study it systematically failed beyond hope of repair. The evening brought the first indication that the Deep Explorer might not survive the storm, as hull stress monitors showed damage patterns that threatened the vessel's structural integrity under continued battering by mountainous seas. Captain Miller's assessment of the situation was grimly realistic. The ship was taking damage faster than it could be repaired, while trapped in weather conditions that showed no signs of moderating according to what little meteorological data remained available. The sophisticated research vessel that had seemed so solid and capable during calm conditions was revealing its vulnerability to forces that exceeded its design parameters. Professor Clark's academic confidence had completely evaporated, as the reality of potentially dying at sea became undeniable, even to someone whose institutional position had insulated him from practical consequences throughout his career. His earlier dismissal of safety concerns and insistence on proceeding despite obvious risks now seemed not just naive, but criminally irresponsible, while his lack of practical experience with maritime emergencies made him a burden rather than asset in circumstances that demanded immediate competent action. The gap between theoretical knowledge and survival skills had never been more apparent or more potentially fatal. The chaos throughout the Deep Explorer reached its peak as multiple systems failed simultaneously, while the vessel struggled against seas that threatened to overwhelm even its sophisticated stability systems. Crew members found themselves trapped in compartments where they had been working when communications failed, unable to coordinate with other personnel or reach emergency stations due to the ship's violent motion and the breakdown of basic operational procedures. The The transformation from confident scientific expedition to desperate fight for survival was complete and terrifying. Jake Thompson's latest assessment of electrical systems revealed cascading failures that threatened to plunge the deep explorer into total darkness, while being battered by weather conditions that could easily destroy a disabled vessel. His expertise with marine electrical systems had never encountered malfunctions that seemed to propagate through supposedly isolated circuits according to patterns that violated fundamental engineering principles, while his diagnostic tools provided readings that suggested either complete instrument failure or electrical phenomena beyond conventional understanding. As the storm reached its full fury and the deep explorer fought for survival against forces that exceeded every design parameter, it became clear that conventional solutions to the crisis were proving inadequate for conditions that challenged the basic assumptions underlying modern maritime technology. The sophisticated equipment that had made the mission possible was failing systematically, while emergency procedures developed for extreme weather assumed operational capabilities that no longer existed. The expedition faced a choice between abandoning all hope of mission success or finding solutions that lay outside the boundaries of conventional marine science. Maggie rose from her workstation with the fluid confidence of someone whose experience had taught her to recognize when theoretical knowledge must give way to practical action. Her quiet observation of the crisis had revealed patterns that the expedition specialists had missed in their focus on individual technical problems, patterns that suggested solutions might exist for someone with the right combination of knowledge and courage. The sophisticated equipment that had failed so catastrophically represented only one approach to deep-sea research, an approach that assumed environmental conditions would always fall within predictable parameters. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable as Maggie straightened to her full height and spoke with authority that cut through the chaos like a blade through water. "Captain Miller," she called out, her voice carrying clearly despite the storm's fury, "I can get us to those formations and complete the mission safely." The reaction was exactly what she had expected. 30 elite researchers and crew members burst into laughter that echoed through the laboratory even above the howling wind, their mirth reflecting the natural human tendency to seek humor in desperate situations, while simultaneously dismissing possibilities that challenged their understanding of what was achievable under such impossible circumstances. The laughter died instantly as Maggie reached into her weathered canvas bag with deliberate precision, her movements carrying an authority that hadn't been present during her earlier interactions with the expedition team. The simple woman who had appeared confused by maritime protocols and intimidated by sophisticated equipment was transforming before their eyes into someone whose confidence suggested capabilities far beyond anything her humble appearance had indicated. Her weathered hands produced a sealed waterproof case that bore the unmistakable markings of classified government documentation, while her posture straightened with the bearing of someone accustomed to command responsibilities in the highest-stakes situations imaginable. Dr. Blake's laughter caught in his throat as he processed the transformation occurring in front of him, his earlier dismissive attitude toward the elderly consultant suddenly seeming like a catastrophic error in judgment. The woman he had barely acknowledged during the expedition's preparation was revealing herself to be someone whose very presence suggested access to resources and authority levels that exceeded his own considerable academic credentials. His face drained of color as he realized that his condescending treatment of what he had assumed was a harmless civilian might have been directed towards someone whose professional status could destroy his career with a single recommendation. Captain Miller moved closer to examine the credentials that Maggie was extracting from her case, his maritime experience having taught him to recognize the difference between routine paperwork and documentation that carried genuine authority. The seals and classification markings on the materials she was presenting bore the unmistakable characteristics of government authorizations that operated at security levels far above anything associated with civilian academic expeditions. His weathered face showed growing amazement as he processed the implications of having someone with such credentials aboard his vessel while remaining completely unaware of their true identity and capabilities. The waterproof case contained documentation that would have seemed impossible if not for the official seals and verification codes that authenticated its contents beyond any reasonable doubt. Maggie's identification revealed her to be Drive Margaret Elena Santos, a designation that meant nothing to most of the expedition members, but which caused Lieutenant Rodriguez to straighten with immediate recognition and barely concealed alarm. The military credentials she displayed indicated clearance levels that exceeded his own considerable access to classified information, while her service record showed assignments to programs whose very existence was unknown to most personnel within the defense establishment. Dr. Walsh stared at the documentation with the expression of someone whose understanding of reality was being fundamentally challenged by information that contradicted everything she thought she knew about the expedition's personnel. The credentials identified Maggie as the former director of Project Deep Reach, a classified research program that had operated during the height of the Cold War with objectives that remained hidden behind security classifications decades after its completion. The implications were staggering. The confused civilian consultant who had been assigned to their team was actually one of the most accomplished deep-sea researchers in human history, someone whose innovations had made modern underwater exploration possible. The verification process that followed revealed the full scope of Maggie's credentials and the carefully constructed cover identity that had allowed her to observe the expedition without revealing her true expertise. Lieutenant Rodriguez accessed secure communication channels that had remained functional despite the electromagnetic interference plaguing other systems, his military connections providing authentication services that confirmed what the documentation claimed. The responses he received caused his already pale complexion to become ashen as he realized the magnitude of authority and capability that had been quietly present throughout their mission. Sarah Chen watched the unfolding revelation with fascination and growing understanding of anomalies she had observed but been unable to explain during the previous days. Maggie's calm competence during the equipment failures, her knowing glances at technical problems that had baffled experienced specialists, and her continued use of instruments that had seemed primitive but which had functioned reliably while sophisticated systems failed systematically. The pieces of a puzzle that had been invisible during the crisis were falling into place with stunning clarity, revealing a picture that challenged everything the young marine biologist had assumed about the expedition's personnel and objectives. The secure communication that Lieutenant Rodriguez established with Naval Headquarters produced responses that transformed the entire atmosphere aboard the Deep Explorer, from desperate emergency to something approaching awestruck reverence. The voice on the encrypted channel spoke with unmistakable authority, as it confirmed not just Maggie's identity but her legendary status within classified circles that most of the expedition members had never known existed. Dr. Margaret Elena Santos was designated as Deep Blue Protocol Executive Authority, a classification that granted her operational control over any maritime research mission involving national security implications. Professor Clark's reaction to the revelation was immediate and telling, his academic arrogance crumbling as he realized that his dismissive attitude toward the elderly woman had been directed toward someone whose contributions to underwater science exceeded his own by several orders of magnitude. The theoretical knowledge that had seemed so impressive in university settings was revealed as superficial understanding compared to the practical expertise possessed by someone who had spent decades pushing the boundaries of what was possible in the most challenging environments on Earth. His earlier condescension now seemed not just inappropriate but professionally suicidal. Dr. Foster's response to learning Maggie's true identity explained the equipment problems that had plagued the expedition from its beginning and revealed why conventional troubleshooting approaches had proven ineffective against malfunctions that seemed to defy logical explanation. The electromagnetic phenomena affecting their instruments were variations of conditions that Maggie had encountered and learned to work with during classified research projects, while her outdated equipment had been specifically designed to function in environments where modern electronics would fail catastrophically. The systematic equipment failures weren't random malfunctions but predictable responses to environmental conditions that mainstream science had yet to acknowledge. Jake Thompson's electrical expertise suddenly seemed inadequate, as he realized that the power fluctuations and system failures he had been struggling to understand represented phenomena that had been studied extensively during classified programs whose results remained hidden behind security classifications. Maggie's continued use of equipment that predated digital technology wasn't nostalgia or stubbornness, but practical recognition that certain environmental conditions required approaches that modern engineering had abandoned in favor of sophistication over reliability. The lessons learned during decades of classified research had never been incorporated into civilian technology because the conditions that made such knowledge necessary were officially considered impossible. The storm that had seemed so threatening to the Deep Explorer's survival was revealed as merely challenging rather than catastrophic when viewed through the lens of experience with extreme underwater operations. Maggie's assessment of the situation demonstrated understanding of weather patterns and ocean dynamics that exceeded the capabilities of the expedition's meteorological equipment. while her evaluation of the ship's condition showed familiarity with maritime engineering that came from years of pushing vessels beyond their supposed design limitations. The crisis that had seemed insurmountable to conventional approaches became manageable when addressed with techniques developed during classified programs. Captain Miller's maritime authority was superseded by credentials that granted Maggie operational control over any aspect of the mission she deemed necessary for successful completion of objectives that apparently extended far beyond academic archaeology. The Deep Blue Protocol designation carried with it resources and authority levels that most military personnel never encountered during their entire careers, while the classification levels associated with her previous assignments suggested involvement in projects whose significance was measured in terms of national security rather than academic discovery. The polite elderly consultant had revealed herself as someone whose word carried the weight of presidential authority in matters involving underwater research. Dr. Walsh's reaction to the credential verification reflected her growing understanding that the expedition's objectives might have been fundamentally different from what she had been led to believe during the mission planning process. The presence of someone with Maggie's classification level and operational authority suggested that the underwater formations had attracted attention from intelligence agencies whose interest in archaeological discoveries was typically limited to sites with strategic or technological significance. The possibility that the geometric patterns detected by their sonar represented more than academic curiosity was becoming increasingly apparent as the true scope of government involvement became clear. The transformation in group dynamics was immediate and profound, as expedition members who had been dismissive of Maggie's contributions now competed to demonstrate their respect for someone whose professional status exceeded their combined credentials by orders of magnitude. Dr. Blake's earlier arrogance was replaced by nervous deference as he realized that his treatment of the expedition's most qualified member had been witnessed by someone whose recommendations could influence his career prospects for decades to come. The social hierarchy that had been based on academic reputation and institutional affiliation was replaced by recognition of genuine expertise and operational authority. Lieutenant Rodriguez's military training had prepared him for encounters with personnel whose classification levels exceeded his own. But the revelation of Maggie's credentials represented authority at levels he had only heard referenced in briefings about programs whose existence was more theoretical than real. The Deep Blue Protocol designation was legendary within certain circles, representing capabilities and resources that most military personnel assumed were either fictional or so highly classified that acknowledging their existence was itself a security violation. The presence of such authority aboard a civilian research vessel suggested objectives that extended far beyond anything described in the expedition's official documentation. The electromagnetic interference that had been systematically destroying the expedition's sophisticated equipment was revealed as a known phenomenon that had been studied extensively during classified research programs, whose results had never been incorporated into civilian technology. Maggie's older instruments weren't primitive alternatives to modern systems, but specialized tools designed specifically for environments where conventional electronics would fail predictably and catastrophically. The knowledge gained during decades of classified research had created a technological divide between official capabilities and actual possibilities that few people outside security establishments ever encountered. Sarah Chen's marine biology training provided context for understanding why the water samples she had analyzed showed such unusual characteristics, and why the electromagnetic signatures she had detected seemed to intensify as the expedition approached the underwater formations. The phenomena she had observed weren't anomalies to be explained by conventional oceanography, but indicators of conditions that had been encountered and studied during classified programs, whose objectives included investigation of environmental factors that could affect national security. The correlation between proximity to the site and equipment failures wasn't coincidence, but evidence of active systems that had been operating beneath the Mediterranean for far longer than anyone had suspected. The mission objectives that had seemed focused on archaeological discovery were revealed as secondary to intelligence-gathering operations that had been planned at government levels far above anything associated with civilian academic research. Maggie's presence on the expedition wasn't coincidental but represented deliberate placement of qualified personnel to assess and potentially interact with whatever lay beneath the seafloor. The geometric formations that had attracted academic attention were already known to intelligence agencies whose interest in ancient civilizations was typically limited to technologies that might have contemporary applications. Dr. Foster's sonar expertise suddenly seemed inadequate. as she realized that the acoustic anomalies she had been detecting represented phenomena that had been studied during classified programs whose results remained hidden behind security classifications that might never be declassified. The sound patterns that her equipment had detected weren't random noise but structured communications or system operations that indicated active rather than passive archaeological remains. The possibility that the underwater formations weren't simply ancient ruins, but functioning installations was becoming increasingly apparent as classified information began to supplement civilian observations. The weather conditions that had threatened the deep explorer's survival were revealed as manageable challenges when addressed with techniques developed during classified operations that had routinely operated in environments far more extreme than anything encountered during civilian research missions. Maggie's assessment of the storm showed understanding of atmospheric dynamics that came from experience with weather modification technologies and environmental manipulation techniques that remained beyond the scope of mainstream meteorology. The tools needed to complete the mission safely existed but required expertise that had been developed during programs whose very existence was classified above the clearance levels of most expedition members. Jake Thompson's struggles with electrical systems that seemed to violate fundamental engineering principles were explained by Maggie's revelation that the electromagnetic phenomena affecting their equipment represented variations of conditions that had been encountered during classified research into technologies that challenged conventional understanding of physics and electronics. The diagnostic readings that had seemed impossible according to mainstream engineering were actually predictable responses to environmental factors that had been studied extensively during programs whose results had never been incorporated into civilian education or commercial applications. The evening brought the full revelation of what the expedition had unknowingly discovered and why Maggie's presence had been considered necessary by agencies whose interest in archaeological research was typically limited to sites with strategic significance. The underwater formations weren't simply ancient ruins but active installations that had been operating beneath the Mediterranean for millennia, their presence known to intelligence agencies, whose mission included monitoring and potentially interacting with technologies that exceeded conventional human capabilities. The academic expedition had been allowed to proceed because it provided cover for intelligence operations that required presence at the site during specific environmental conditions. Captain Miller's understanding of his vessel's capabilities was expanded by Maggie's explanation of modifications that had been made to the Deep Explorer during its construction, modifications that weren't reflected in civilian documentation, but which provided capabilities necessary for operations in environments where conventional maritime technology would fail catastrophically. The research vessel had been designed from the beginning to serve dual purposes, supporting both civilian scientific research and classified operations that required equipment and expertise beyond anything available through normal channels. Professor Clark's academic theories about ancient civilizations were revealed as partial understanding of realities that had been known to government agencies for decades, their significance extending far beyond historical curiosity to include active monitoring of technologies that continued to operate thousands of years after their creators had disappeared from human history. The knowledge that he had hoped to gain through archaeological research was already possessed by classified programs whose objectives included determining whether such technologies posed threats or opportunities for contemporary human civilization. Dr. Walsh's expedition had succeeded beyond her wildest academic dreams, discovering not just evidence of advanced ancient civilization but active proof that such civilizations had possessed technologies that continued to function in the present day. However, the classification levels associated with such discoveries meant that her role would shift from academic researcher to participant in government programs whose objectives extended far beyond university research into areas where knowledge itself became a matter of national security rather than academic publication. The Deep Explorer's sophisticated equipment had failed not due to design flaws or operational errors, but because it had encountered environmental conditions that required specialized approaches developed during classified programs whose existence was known only to personnel with security clearances far above anything associated with civilian research. The systematic nature of the equipment failures reflected protective responses by ancient technologies that had been designed to remain hidden from observation by civilizations that lacked appropriate credentials for interaction. The storm that had threatened to destroy the expedition was revealed as a secondary effect of the underwater installations responding to unauthorized proximity by equipment that lacked proper identification codes, their defensive systems creating electromagnetic interference that affected everything from navigation to communication, while simultaneously generating atmospheric disturbances that intensified natural weather patterns. The approaching weather system hadn't been coincidental, but had been triggered by the expedition's presence at the site, making evacuation impossible until proper protocols were established for peaceful interaction. Maggie's quiet observation during the crisis had been professional assessment of systems that she had been trained to recognize and interact with during classified programs, whose objectives included establishing communication protocols with technologies that predated human civilization by millennia. Her older equipment hadn't been primitive, but had been specifically designed for environments where such technologies were known to exist, while her expertise included procedures for establishing peaceful contact that had been developed during decades of research into phenomena that remained officially impossible according to civilian science. The revelation that had begun with simple credential verification was expanding into complete transformation of everything the expedition members thought they knew about their mission, their capabilities, and the reality of what lay beneath the Mediterranean seafloor. The academic discovery that should have been the culmination of careers was becoming the beginning of involvement in programs whose objectives extended far beyond university research into areas where knowledge itself carried implications for the future of human civilization and humanity's relationship with technologies that challenged every assumption about the development of intelligence on Earth. The descent began at dawn, with Maggie operating equipment that seemed to bridge the gap between conventional marine technology and something far more sophisticated than anything the expedition had previously encountered. Her specialized diving apparatus bore no resemblance to the standard pressure suits that had failed systematically during the crisis, instead incorporating design elements that suggested development during classified programs whose objectives had included interaction with environments where conventional technology proved inadequate. The electromagnetic interference that had crippled the Deep Explorer's sophisticated systems had no effect on her gear, which seemed designed specifically for conditions that mainstream engineering considered impossible. Captain Miller watched from the bridge as Maggie prepared for a descent that violated every safety protocol he had learned during his decades of maritime experience. Yet her confidence in the authority of her credentials left him no choice but to trust expertise that exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. The depth gauges that should have been monitoring her progress provided readings that seemed impossible according to conventional understanding of deep-sea operations, while her communication signals remained clear and strong, despite electromagnetic conditions that had made radio contact impossible for all other equipment aboard the research vessel. Dr. Blake observed the descent preparations with the humbled fascination of someone whose understanding of underwater archaeology was being revolutionized by witnessing techniques that existed nowhere in academic literature or civilian training programs. The woman he had dismissed as a confused elderly consultant was demonstrating capabilities that challenged every assumption about what was possible in deep-sea research, while her casual expertise with equipment that seemed decades ahead of conventional technology suggested access to resources that remained hidden behind classification levels he couldn't imagine. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by professional awe and personal embarrassment at having failed to recognize genuine expertise when it had been quietly present throughout the expedition. The water around the Deep Explorer began to exhibit phenomena that defied conventional oceanography as Maggie's descent approached the mysterious formations that had attracted the expedition's attention. Bioluminescent patterns appeared in geometric configurations that suggested artificial rather than natural origins, while the electromagnetic readings that had seemed anomalous during surface observations intensified into structured signals that resembled communication protocols more than random interference. Sarah Chen's marine biology training provided no framework for understanding organisms that seemed to respond to human presence with mathematical precision, creating displays that appeared designed to convey information rather than simply react to environmental stimuli. Lieutenant Rodriguez monitored secure communication channels that provided real-time updates from agencies whose interest in the mission extended far beyond academic archaeology into areas where discoveries could affect national security and international relations. The responses he received confirmed that Maggie's descent was being tracked by satellite systems and underwater monitoring networks whose existence wasn't acknowledged in civilian documentation, while her progress toward the formations was being coordinated with operations that remained classified above his clearance level. The academic expedition had become a focal point for intelligence activities that spanned multiple agencies and international boundaries. Dr. Foster's sonar equipment, which had been providing contradictory readings throughout the crisis, suddenly began functioning with unprecedented clarity as Maggie approached the underwater structures. The acoustic signatures she detected revealed formations of staggering complexity and massive scale, extending deep into the seafloor with architectural precision that exceeded anything associated with known ancient civilizations. The geometric patterns that had been visible on surface scans were merely the uppermost portions of installations that stretched for miles beneath the Mediterranean, their sophisticated design suggesting technologies that challenged conventional understanding of prehistoric human capabilities. The first visual contact with the formations came through Maggie's specialized camera systems, which penetrated the electromagnetic interference that had blinded conventional observation equipment throughout the expedition. The images transmitted to the Deep Explorer revealed structures that seemed to blend ancient architectural principles with technological sophistication that exceeded contemporary human engineering, creating installations that appeared both timeless and impossibly advanced. The massive stone blocks that formed the visible portions of the complex were carved with precision that modern tools could barely achieve, while embedded within them were systems that generated the electromagnetic phenomena that had been affecting the expedition's equipment. Jake Thompson's electrical expertise was expanded beyond recognition as he monitored power systems that seemed to draw energy from sources that violated conventional understanding of physics and engineering. The electromagnetic signatures emanating from the formations weren't random interference but structured energy transmission that suggested active power generation and distribution networks operating according to principles that had never been incorporated into mainstream electrical engineering. The installations weren't ancient ruins, but functioning facilities that had been operating continuously for millennia, their energy requirements met by technologies that remained beyond human comprehension or replication. Professor Clark's academic theories about lost civilizations were transformed from historical speculation into immediate reality, as Maggie's cameras revealed inscriptions and architectural details that provided direct evidence of the advanced society that had constructed the underwater complex. The symbols carved into massive stone surfaces weren't primitive pictographs, but sophisticated mathematical and scientific notation that demonstrated knowledge of physics and engineering that exceeded contemporary human understanding in several critical areas. The civilization that had built these installations possessed technologies that modern science was only beginning to approach, while their understanding of electromagnetic phenomena and energy manipulation remained centuries ahead of current human capabilities. The communication protocols that Maggie employed during her interaction with the ancient systems revealed training and procedures that had been developed during classified programs whose objectives included establishing peaceful contact with technologies that predated human civilization. Her approach to the installations followed carefully structured sequences that identified her as authorized personnel rather than unauthorized intrusion, while her equipment provided responses that satisfied authentication requirements built into defensive systems that had been protecting the complex for thousands of years. The interaction between human technology and ancient installations proceeded according to diplomatic protocols that had been established through decades of careful research and negotiation. Dr. Walsh watched the developing contact with amazement that transformed her understanding of archaeology from historical research into active diplomacy, with civilizations whose technological achievements exceeded anything documented in human history. The expedition that had begun as academic investigation was revealing itself as carefully orchestrated first contact between contemporary human civilization and ancient technologies that had been waiting beneath the Mediterranean for the development of appropriate diplomatic and technological capabilities. The discovery of Atlantis was proving to be not just archaeological triumph, but the beginning of relationships that could transform human understanding of technology, history, and humanity's place in the broader development of intelligence on Earth. The ancient installations responded to Maggie's presence with activation sequences that brought dormant systems online for the first time in centuries, their operations creating electromagnetic phenomena that had initially been perceived as interference, but which were actually communication attempts directed towards civilizations capable of appropriate technological responses. The complex had been designed as a monitoring station and diplomatic facility, its purpose including observation of human technological development and preparation for eventual contact when humanity achieved sufficient sophistication for peaceful interaction with technologies that exceeded their current capabilities by several orders of magnitude. Sarah Chen's analysis of the biological phenomena surrounding the installations revealed that the bioluminescent displays weren't natural organisms but biotechnological interfaces that had been developed by the ancient civilization as communication tools for species that relied primarily on visual rather than electromagnetic signaling methods. The mathematical patterns that appeared in response to human presence were welcoming messages and basic information about the facility's purpose, while more complex displays provided preliminary technical data about technologies that could be shared once appropriate diplomatic protocols had been established and maintained over extended periods. The storm that had threatened the deep explorer's survival began to subside as the ancient installations recognized legitimate contact and ceased generating the defensive electromagnetic interference that had been affecting modern equipment throughout the region. Captain Miller's navigation system suddenly returned to normal operation as protective measures that had been triggered by unauthorized proximity were deactivated in response to Maggie's successful authentication with the complex's security protocols. The weather patterns that had seemed so threatening were revealed as secondary effects of defensive systems that had been designed to discourage investigation by civilizations that lacked appropriate technological and diplomatic credentials. Lieutenant Rodriguez received updates through secure channels that confirmed the successful establishment of formal diplomatic contact with installations that had been monitored by intelligence agencies for decades without successful communication attempts. The protocols that Maggie was implementing had been developed through years of careful study and preparation, while her success in achieving productive interaction represented a breakthrough that would have implications extending far beyond archaeological discovery into areas of technology transfer and international relations that could affect the development of human civilization for generations to come. The technical specifications that began flowing from the ancient installations to Maggie's specialized equipment included preliminary information about energy generation methods that could revolutionize human understanding of physics and engineering, while communication protocols provided frameworks for ongoing diplomatic contact that would allow gradual technology transfer without disrupting human social and economic systems. The civilization that had constructed the complex had anticipated eventual contact with emerging technological societies and had prepared comprehensive programs for peaceful interaction that balanced technological advancement with social stability. Dr. Foster's sonar readings revealed that the installations she had been detecting represented only a small portion of a global network of similar facilities that had been established by the ancient civilization as monitoring and communication stations throughout Earth's oceans. The Mediterranean complex was one of dozens of similar installations that had been observing human development for millennia while preparing for eventual diplomatic contact when humanity achieved sufficient technological sophistication for productive interaction. The discovery that had begun as archaeological investigation was expanding into awareness of ancient infrastructure that spanned the globe and had been operating continuously since before the rise of recorded human history. Jake Thompson's electrical monitoring revealed that the power systems operating within the ancient complex were providing energy output that exceeded the total electrical generation capacity of several modern nations, while their efficiency levels approached theoretical perfection according to contemporary understanding of thermodynamics. The technology demonstrations that were being shared through diplomatic channels included preliminary information about energy generation methods that could eliminate resource scarcity and environmental degradation, while providing unlimited clean power for human civilization's continued development and expansion beyond Earth's boundaries. The successful completion of first contact protocols triggered activation of communication systems that had been dormant for centuries, establishing direct links between the Mediterranean installation and similar facilities throughout the world's oceans, while simultaneously opening channels for ongoing diplomatic interaction between human governments and the ancient civilization that had been observing human development from beneath the seas. The implications extended far beyond archaeological discovery into areas of technology, diplomacy, and human development that would reshape civilization itself. Professor Clark's academic career was transformed from theoretical research into practical involvement in diplomatic programs that would require decades of careful study and cultural exchange to manage successfully. The knowledge that was being made available through established contact included not just technological information, but historical records that would revolutionize human understanding of planetary development and the evolution of intelligence on Earth. The university programs that had seemed so important during the expedition's planning phase were revealed as preliminary preparation for educational initiatives that would prepare humanity for participation in galactic civilization. Dr. Walsh's expedition had achieved success beyond anything imaginable in conventional archaeological terms, establishing contact with an ancient civilization whose technological achievements exceeded contemporary human capabilities, while opening diplomatic channels that would provide opportunities for peaceful technology transfer and cultural exchange. The academic recognition that had seemed so important during the mission's planning was replaced by involvement in government programs whose objectives included managing humanity's introduction to technologies and knowledge that could accelerate human development by centuries, while maintaining social stability during the transition period. The Mediterranean installation that had been discovered through the expedition's archaeological research was revealed as Earth's primary diplomatic facility for interaction between human civilization and the ancient society that had been observing human development from underwater installations throughout the planet. The complex had been designed specifically for first contact scenarios and included facilities for ongoing diplomatic exchange, technology transfer, and cultural interaction that would provide frameworks for peaceful cooperation between civilizations separated by thousands of years of technological development but united by shared origins on the same planet. Maggie's successful completion of the mission represented not just personal triumph, but the culmination of decades of preparation by government agencies, whose objectives had included preparing for eventual contact with ancient civilizations whose technological capabilities exceeded human understanding. Her expertise with classified technologies and diplomatic protocols had made possible the peaceful establishment of relationships that would provide opportunities for human advancement while maintaining the stability necessary for successful cultural and technological integration over extended time periods. The return to the surface brought confirmation that the mission had succeeded beyond all expectations, establishing diplomatic contact that would provide access to technologies capable of solving humanity's most pressing challenges, while opening cultural exchange opportunities that would enrich human understanding of planetary history and the development of intelligence throughout the galaxy. The simple woman who had been dismissed by academic experts had revealed herself as one of humanity's most accomplished deep-sea researchers and diplomatic specialists, whose expertise had made possible achievements that would reshape human civilization and establish Earth's place within broader galactic community structures. The aftermath of the successful contact mission saw implementation of carefully planned protocols for managing technology transfer and cultural exchange that would provide humanity with access to advanced knowledge while maintaining social stability during transition periods that could span several generations. The institutions that had supported the expedition found themselves transformed into diplomatic and educational organizations whose objectives included preparing human civilization for participation in galactic society while preserving cultural independence and technological autonomy that would allow humanity to contribute unique perspectives and capabilities to broader interstellar civilization. The woman who had been laughed at for suggesting she could complete an impossible mission had proven that experience and expertise could accomplish what sophisticated technology could not, while simultaneously revealing that humanity's greatest discoveries often came through recognizing capabilities that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. The Mediterranean had given up its greatest secret not to those who possessed the most advanced equipment, but to someone whose knowledge bridged the gap between human technology and ancient wisdom, proving that true exploration required not just sophisticated tools, but the wisdom to recognize when different approaches were necessary for achieving unprecedented objectives. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.